What do you need to do? What kind of conversations do you have to have? What stakeholders do you have to have in alignment to say, hey, listen, if we want to prove more value in events, this is what we need to track, and this is the type of technology or dashboards that we need to do that, or this is how we're going to get sales involved. Welcome, everyone. As everyone's still kind of trickling in, I am really excited for this hour, and we've got a lot to cover. I'm going to introduce first Sarah. Sarah is here. She is the Director of Corporate Events of MathWorks, and you have over 25 years of experiential event strategy and corporate events strategy. You're also a board member of PCMA of New England, right?
That's correct. Yeah, I started
Yeah.
when I was 5. Yeah.
That's amazing. You just started young, right? When you were a baby. And
Right.
you're
With
tuning
that
in
trapper
right
keeper.
from,
With the
yes,
trapper
yes,
keeper.
with that
Right.
trapper keeper. And you're tuning in just outside of Boston. And Garrett
That's right.
here, one of my other favorites, you are head of global events at Silicon Labs. And you have over 14 years of B2B global events. You actually helped us run a leadership panel at our own hosted event marketing congress, and you just blew me away with your knowledge and your expertise, especially your input on leadership. And some of your other prior brands that you worked for were Indeed, Spiceworks, Ziff Davis, right? And you're
That's
tuning in from
correct.
Austin. I'd love to hear in
I
the
am.
chat where everyone else is tuning in from, because I like to see where we are. I'm here in Orlando today in our office. So lots of fun. Now, we're talking about schools getting started. I think we're all kind of on this cusp of getting into the busy season again in fall, right? For fall events. And a lot of us are in the day to day, in the to dos for right now. But 2026 is going to be here before we know it. So today, I really wanted to highlight how we can plan to win and how the two of you are really getting ahead for 2026. And I think that there's going to be a lot of takeaways here for everyone to really get prepared while you're always trying to multitask and handle what you've got today. What are we going to do to plan for tomorrow? So, Garrett, I'm going to ask you. I'm going to start this off. Now that budgets are set and the year's events are pretty much wrapped so far, right? They're in motion. You're wrapping up 2025. What does your process look like for planning for next year?
So I wish I could say that mine were about wrapped up. We're actually kind of in a ramping cycle to the end of the year. We've got our own kind of hosted user conference series that's gearing up for later in Q4. So we have to wear a couple of parallel hats at the same time, planning and
Sure.
executing. And I feel very fortunate to work for a company that has what I consider a very well aligned kind of annual planning cycle that is kind of standardized across different teams with very clear deadlines and kind of sets of expectations, which I think for me has been, there are very clear indicators and kind of planning touch points that the entire company has to meet, which has really helped us kind of align cross-functionally with other teams, setting expectations and goals. And just it kind of takes the guesswork and mystery, or God forbid, like one team saying they have no idea what's going on with events, out, and it's worked really well for us in the past. So I can't recommend it enough. Just kind of it starts from the top, and the executives set kind of the planning cycle dates, and everyone kind of follows along through that order. So it's been pretty simple.
That's really great to put it really eloquently. You're wearing multiple hats, right? There's the planning and then of course, the executing hat. But I like having preset dates. That really does help from the top down of like what to expect, where to come prepared with. You guys aren't just, rolling with the punches per se as the months go by. That's really great. Now, Sarah, how are you reviewing or evaluating typically what did and didn't work from the year that you're in or the years prior?
Yeah, I think, historically, my process has really been about going back to the data, right? I've always been very data driven. I've always been someone who makes decisions based on outcomes and based on, where we landed in relation to what we set out to accomplish and what we actually accomplished. And so there's a lot of places that data comes from. I think one of them one of the inputs that I like to use is retrospectives or postmortems, as some folks call them. But going into those calls and those notes that you had from the immediate impact of those events postmortem, and then also looking at what were the goals that we had, what were the objectives, what were the KPIs that we were aligning success with, and did we achieve those? Has there been additional efforts on behalf of sales, or has there been additional ways to leverage the success of those events since that time? And really going in and diving into the systems, if it's your Salesforce, if it's your Eloqua, if it's your Marketo, or however you're actually gauging the success of your events, going back in and saying, has it shifted since we last looked at it? Because some sales cycles that are longer, you want to be looking at that not just right after the event, but several months afterwards as well. So that's sort of my first approach, is to look at the numbers, look at the data, look at the success, and find out, did we hit our mark? Did we achieve what we set out to achieve? If not, is that because of something we did? Is it because of the actual event itself? Is there something that can be changed? Are those still the same goals? So I think overall, before we're looking at the data and the success, also looking at our measurement strategy and saying, did we achieve the goals? Great, but are those the same goals going into it for next year? Did we uncover something else that's of value for that particular event? Whether that be, we were approaching it for an awareness perspective, and we actually got some opportunity in sales. So do we want to ride that wave and focus more on the efforts to dive into more of a business impact for a particular event? So looking at, are we measuring the right things, and really level setting with your stakeholders too, and understanding, is this still the right event? Are we engaging with the right people? Do we have the same message? So I think the stakeholder alignment and making sure that, if this is something that we want to repeat, is it being repeated in the same way? Do we have to shift things? We were focused on this product release last year. Is there something new that we want to focus on next year? So I think all of those pieces, so the data, the measurement plan, and the stakeholders are all important to check in on before you start to plan for next year, because that will help to dictate what you might need to design going into the following year.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So this question kind of is for both of you. So you have your target dates where you want to start your planning. And Sarah, as you said, you've taken some time to really review and evaluate. What are the next steps for both of you? And how do you formulate what that strategy looks like for 2026? Now, I know you reviewed things that worked and didn't work, but is there a formula, or is there like a spreadsheet or any sort of way that you organize planning in advance for 2026?
I think from my perspective, it's important to be consistent with what we're looking at event over event, especially for like events, like if they're multiple third-party events or multiple proprietary events, that we're looking at similar things, and that we're figuring out from a measurement standpoint, what is it that we're looking at that we might need to bring into planning for next year. I think another thing, that I didn't really talk about is budgets. And, did we go over budget? Did we come in under budget? Do we need more budget? From a strategic standpoint, if we need to do more or be all in on an event that perhaps was a pilot for the previous year, but now we want to focus more on it because it actually did garner some results. From a strategy standpoint, I think it's important to understand what that means from a budget implication standpoint as well. So, if something is doing something really well, again, adjusting the measurement strategy to account for that, but also making sure that we are illustrating that business impact using the data in order to secure the budgets, in order to help develop, whatever that business impact is that we're looking for.
I was just going to echo that same sentiment. I think it's so true. And I think, tool wise, I've seen it done differently in different organizations. One thing I think that I've seen work well is cross-functional event scorecard approach, and kind of allowing other teams to weigh in on their own priorities, and kind of having that standardized tool to weigh in and say, hey, if we're going to go to this event, it has to reach at least 4 out of 5, right, on the priorities of the different sectors that you've deemed, these are our strategic priorities. And that kind of helps. I just think having a visual, having something that everyone agrees, yes, this is our priority, and yes, this does make sense. It checks the box to move forward in making that investment. I think between year to year, at least in my industry, one of the challenges is not every event happens every year, and sometimes it happens every other year. So the budget implications from shifts of year to year to get that commitment and how those dollars are allocated and maintained and not taken away from you and given to someone else is also kind of an art and a science, and just makes the budget planning process even more challenging sometimes. So good to have that standardization and tool in place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious in organizations and every organization does tend to be a little bit different when it comes to budgets. Some are coming from the top down, right, and dictating how much you can spend. And then I'm assuming those event marketers are trying to see what can they do within that budget. But then there's other ways, as you're saying, of like measuring like this scorecard, right, and determining those that are ranking high that must have and they make an impact based off of previous experience or not. That's where we should be budgeting for. And then you kind of have a view of, okay, this is how much we're going to need this year to execute on those, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think from a budgetary perspective, typically I've seen it be here's your number, work within it. But I've also seen tell me what you need based on what we're trying to accomplish. And then it's a little bit more effort, I think, in that way, because we as the event professionals have to be able to justify the spend in terms of how that impacts the results and why, if we're spending that money, what do we expect to get out of it? And what's the incremental value of those dollars spent? So I think it's a little bit more work on us to prove the reasoning behind why we're asking for additional funds. Yeah, as somebody just said, investing in new technology, that's a perfect example of, one of the things that we always look at too is beyond just the business impact is, did we have the right approach? Do we have the right people involved? Do we have the right teams? Do we have the right processes? Are we using the right tools? And sometimes the answer is, it'd be a lot more efficient if we could bring this tool on board. A good
Exactly.
example of that is, one of our events, we had a ton of, at one point in my career, there was a ton of meetings that were happening in conjunction with a third party event, and they weren't really getting captured. We weren't capturing the value of what were the conversations that were being had. How do we know when to schedule? When is the room available that we have? And so we brought on a meeting scheduling tool that helped to increase the value of our event by like 360%, because now we could attribute all
Wow.
these conversations back to the event itself. So it's a good example of how I created a business case to say, hey, we're having all these meetings that they're happening. We have no visibility into them. It makes sense for us to bring on this tool for us to capture that information. And so I built out that business case and was able to bring that on board. And it actually ended up proving additional ROI for that particular event. So that's a great example. Technology is a great example of things that you just have to kind of create the story behind the why, and that can ultimately
Sure.
help to add
It's
additional
kind of
value
finding a
to it.
balance of like the nice to haves, because there's always some things that we're going to like think, oh man, if one day we'd love to have that, versus what you're saying. Sometimes it's a must have, right? In order for us to prove the effectiveness of our and the pipeline impact of our events, we really should absolutely invest in this technology. And I like seeing the balance between the two. I do have to say in the chat, we've got a few really great additions here. So Michelle said that we're going through a rebrand, and knowing the cost that comes with that and it involves replacing all of my assets for shows and which ones are the most important, right? So finding a balance there. And Sherry said the budget is set, planning activities now, judging what worked best, which got the most leads or sales or new customers is the most difficult challenge. So yeah, going back to the metrics and scorecards, it's, if you don't have the metrics planned in advance, it's hard to then determine, the impact, right? So that tends to be a challenge that some event marketers have. So looking at the year in advance, right? What do you need to do? What kind of conversations do you have to have? What stakeholders do you have to have in alignment to say, hey, listen, if we want to prove more value in events, this is what we need to track, and this is the type of technology or dashboards that we need to do that, or this is how we're going to get sales involved. Oh, and we've got a question. So Mark put in, he said, what are your typical ROIs? And if it's sales pipeline, how long down the road to actually measure this success? If it's awareness, how do you measure that? And I'll open this for both of you to answer.
I'll
How do you
start.
measure awareness?
Thanks, Mark,
Yes,
for
tell
starting with the
us.
easy ones. It's different for every company. For me, in my current situation, we also just recently went through a rebrand, and so are very attuned to kind of what changes in perception. NPS is probably one of the more standard brand awareness measurements that you can use depending on if that's what you're looking for, for how likely are you to recommend our brand. Obviously the sales component, the revenue is crucial to any business. For our business, it's not as acute as how many transactions were completed on show site. It's more attuned to the different touch points within the sales cycle and how valuable those are, and compared to, hey, they met with us at this event in person, they took the time out of their day to receive a demo. That's a lot more important than they viewed a white paper on our website, right? So being able to kind of consistently measure and show that impact as aligned to the global marketing initiatives and goals is really important, and something that we do. And that's kind of the key way that we're able to show ROI today. Yeah.
I think for awareness from, in my history, it's really about cross-functional participation, because I think as event professionals, we know that, we're a cog in the marketing wheel, and we're, if we rest on the laurels completely solo of our own event without it being a fully integrated into other marketing initiatives, then we're doing ourselves a disservice, right? And so I think from an awareness perspective, we're looking at how the event generated interest far beyond just the event itself. So we're looking at social media hits or use of the hashtags that we're creating. We're looking at things that were, visits to the website around the time that we sent out emails. We're looking at email click-throughs. We're looking at, open rates and a whole lot of other metrics beyond just the sales metrics and the events and the opportunities and the leads and the KPIs that are specifically associated with the event. I think that's where it's really helpful to have sort of a tie-in to the broader marketing teams, the broader marketing organization. And obviously, if you're in a smaller company, that may very well be you, so you don't have to go very far. But I think that it's really important to sort of have your finger on the pulse of what other interest is being generated as a result of your communication efforts surrounding your event beyond just the event itself.
I love that. Actually, I have to say, Michelle, you're on fire in the chat today. I love it. Michelle just said, I just had a meeting with all of my sales reps on how I can make their life easier, how they can help me better show ROI, and what worked well and what needs to change. I really like this idea of going back to the sales team and getting some feedback from them. She also said, I also gave them a sneak peek into my new go-to-market strategy for 2026 to see the reaction of all of them. And then she also said, in regards to awareness, after my event surveys that I send out to all my attendees and how they felt before then after attending one of our activities, education, visiting the booth, how likely are they to purchase, and would they recommend our company to another person? Yeah, like very similar to like an NPS score, right? So it's really about determining the metrics that matter not only to just the event itself, but really the impact on the business. What are the business metrics that matter for marketing, sales, etc.? And I love what you said, Garrett, is like the NPS scores and really just kind of getting a feel for how they're feeling on things. I would really love to hear. Oh,
sorry,
no,
one
go
other
ahead, please.
quick thing,
I love
just
it.
in terms of that cross-functional collaboration, and really what was just alluded to there is checking in with your stakeholders and making sure that their goals are part of your goals, right? Because if, there's a lot of stakeholders that may have a specific piece that they're interested in, and checking in with them and saying, hey, this is what we accomplished, is that work with you? Does that resonate with you? Is really helpful, because then you have sort of that alignment and support for, whether or not you want to continue, even if it's not an intrinsic value. If they feel like, yes, I got a lot of value out of this, and even just content reuse and things like that are also valuable. So how much are people doing post event, and how much, time is saved by us creating all of this content that now people can leverage. So I think that's important too, is checking in with your stakeholders and making sure that they have that partnership with you, and that they're, able to leverage the success of the event beyond just the event itself as well.
I always believe that it takes time to do this, but getting stakeholders to be advocates for events because they see the impact, because their needs are being met, and the events are a component of that, I think is really, really important. And there's a balance of leading versus lagging too. And I think that I always like to talk about that. So the initial event, the scorecard that you're looking through, what initially were good success key points, but then what are some things that we should continue to be feeding back to stakeholders on a monthly basis for even an event that happened last year, right? Because you never know, it might have a longer sales cycle or other touch points that happen from there. So I think balancing out, initial feedback of instant, like this is what worked immediately after, and then the long-term reporting is really key too. So for both of you, planning ahead, right? There's an evolution of events. We've all seen it, year over year, things change. What would be absolute must-have focuses that anyone doing their 2026 strategy planning now should be focusing on? And also, what should they be dropping or forgetting?
I think from my perspective, it sort of goes back to the first question is you got to look at your data, you got to look at your results, and you got to understand how that impacts what you're planning for the following year. And also, how, your measurement strategy as a whole. Because I think a measurement strategy isn't just the measurement at the end of the event. It's something that you have to develop up front because there could potentially be ways that you capture data that need to be incorporated into the event design. So for instance, somebody mentioned, surveying before and after. If you don't have that set out at the onset, how are you going to get the before, right? So that's a perfect example of how looking at your measurement strategy and understanding what you need to capture when is really important because sometimes maybe it's sentiment. Maybe you want to put one of those, happy faces in your booth to see, if people enjoyed their experience there or something. But again, that's something you have to think about up front. So I think for me, that's really important is again, to make sure that we're data driven and we're looking at success and results. And if we don't have clear measurements and KPIs established up front, then we're not going to be able to really tell that story of success in the back end.
How
I
about you,
totally
Garrett?
agree. Yeah, I think, as event marketers, it's very difficult to even remember that there is a rear view mirror, right? When you're looking back at data points, because 2026 is coming in like a freight train. But I think it is an absolutely crucial step, right? And whatever that looks like for you. And I love the customer sentiment data. I think, I've seen groups do focus groups with core customers to get those kind of key prioritizations from their perspective and giving yourself a little bit of grace and understanding that not every event type is cut from the same, set of performance metrics. And you really have to customize and tailor what you're defining as success based on what that event is. My success metrics for a trade show are nowhere near the same success metrics as my hosted conferences, right? And kind of aligning those metrics and customizing those and tailoring them will give you the best, cleanest data that you can, which will help you make decisions moving forward.
Yeah.
I love this question. Mark just popped this in. This is more career focused, but it's very much in line with measurement. And so I want to bring it up to both of you. Mark says, so as an event person who understands measurement, but doesn't have a lot of data driven on my resume, how do you overcome that?
That's a great question because everybody's going to start somewhere. I mean, there was a
Sure.
point when I wasn't in leadership, when I was making that transition from being looked at as a tactical, event coordinator to, being in management and being in and going up the leadership ladder as opposed to, being stuck in the weeds. And that's a hard transition. I think a lot of it is just proactively taking on that measurement strategy, proactively looking at ways to showcase the success. And that could be as easy as look at what my negotiation skills resulted in. My negotiation skills resulted in a 10% reduction in, initial quotes versus what we spent.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, starting with something as simple as that, but then, going in and building out campaigns within Salesforce to say, hey, we're going to track these people and here's the results after, 3, 6, 9, 12 months later. I think you just have to be your own best advocate and really start somewhere because, the numbers aren't going to generate themselves. And, again, just even that incremental value and being able to highlight that and articulate that on your resume is going to show that's the mindset that you have.
I completely agree. And potentially finding metrics that you're not currently tracking, like numbers of meetings and the impact of the ROI yielding from your, specific trade. There are 100% that there is something that's not tracked or should be tracked differently or for a different amount of time. Maybe it's not, look, we're just looking at it 30 days out. We need to be looking at it 90 days out and show the broader picture of impact. I think, and the bigger thing is being able to and get some senior leaders. Hey, I went out, I was looking into all the leads that we brought back from XYZ trade show, connecting teams, Turns out the result of that event is they went to, reached out for more information on XYZ products, kind of showing the customer journey. The follow-up to those events are another way to say, hey, just because the event is over doesn't mean the customer experience is over. And this is how I think we should be looking at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's
I
all
think
these
that's
like little
great.
micro moments,
Yeah.
that are impactful that, might not be officially tracked by the company, but there are wins that you have along the way that you absolutely need to highlight in your career and keep track of them. I think we are so quickly moving on to the next thing, but having like personal records, like a PR list, right? A little Google Doc or a note on your phone of like keeping track of some really major wins is good because collectively you're starting to see this whole running win list. And that's something you can go back when you're not feeling good about where you're at. You can go back and be like, you know what, I did that. I did that. That's a really good thing to, add to your resume the next time you update it. So I love this. I love where we're going in terms of planning for 2026. Are there any things that you think the industry or organizations or event marketers as a whole should be doing differently or that you would be doing differently in 2026?
I think from my perspective, one of the trends that we all hear about constantly is AI, right? And how we're integrating AI into our workflows. How is generative AI creating efficiencies in our approach? And I think we're talking a lot about business impact, but we're definitely also talking about creating efficiencies within our own teams, right? Doing more with less, being more impactful, more efficient, especially for those in smaller roles where you're a one-man band, you have to be efficient. And I know, Coty, we were together at SEMA in Austin, in your neck of the woods, Garrett. But one of the biggest takeaways for me from SEMA was going into AI and asking AI how to use AI. Here's my
Yeah.
job description. What tasks can I automate using AI? Lo and
I think I have a
behold,
picture of
AI will
that
have an
keynote.
answer for you.
Yes. It's so
And I was
brilliant,
like, that's
right?
so simple. It's so silly that I didn't think of that before hearing it from somebody else. But so I
I
impart
think
that.
everyone in the room took a picture of that because it's like, duh, I didn't think about
It's so
that.
simple. Yeah. So I think
Yep.
that's one of the things, in terms of, I don't like to say like, oh, get on the bandwagon with trends, but I think with AI, it's so important to understand how it's going to impact your own personal workflows. And so kind of getting ahead of that and understanding how best to integrate that into your approach is really going to be important.
To
Could
piggyback
not
off
agree
of that,
more.
because I'm a huge fan of AI, right? It's about rather than being scared of it and just saying, well, I don't know how to use it, so I'm not going to do it. Just try, just go in there, create a ChatGPT account or, use your Microsoft Copilot if you have access to that. Just try it. And just like you said, Sarah, asking it, this is my job. How could I use you to help me? Right? Get creative and don't be afraid because you're not breaking anything, right? You're only finding ways to more or less give yourself more capacity, right? For working on the business versus in the business or vice versa, right? Whatever your passion is. So, Gara, how about you?
Yeah, I completely agree. I know AI is such a buzzword right now, but I think it's so important that we are talking about it. And if you're listening, please put how you use AI in your day-to-day in the chat. I think a couple great ones for me are just from an administrative perspective. AI listens to all of the group meetings that I have and creates beautiful summaries complete with action items and everything that I can send out immediately after a meeting. And it has saved me so much time. A little bit, we've used it within kind of the event platform world. I don't think we're quite where I'd like it to be. I'd love one day, if you're hosting an event and your agenda is large, more of the personalization assistance could be helpful. I think if you could personalize an agenda based on whoever is on your website registering for the event's interests are, taking out the need for them to read every single session and description and speaker, I think that would save so much time, but I haven't found a solution
Oh, I
for
love
that
that.
yet. So if you have it, let us know. But I would love to learn from you guys as well on how you're using it in your day to day. And I think as we go, people will be using it more and more each day.
I think for me,
And
one of
Michelle,
the biggest things that I've really found it to be super useful with is aggregating large amounts of data into like
mhm.
bite-sized, actionable bullet points. So, I think putting in survey results from your post-event surveys and saying, we talked about retrospectives and we talked or postmortems or whatever you call them, throwing all that data into AI and saying, create me 4 slides that summarize all of this data and talk about action items and things we want to change going into the next iteration of this event. And lo and behold, it will put together 4 nice little slides for you with the bullets you asked for. So that to
Oh,
me
that's a good
saved
one.
me hours and hours and hours of analyzation and pulling together
Brain power.
slides and a lot of work. So that's one way that I find it useful.
Michelle put in there that she uses Manus. It's been a game changer. It can create landing pages, websites, activation tools, and it also does a lot of research for me using the agent tools. And I mean, in my day-to-day using AI for data analysis, right, comparison, I think it can help write scripts too. So as you're trying to create and tell a story around the theme or how you're showing up, how can you use AI to write out scripts and kind of preparing everybody on the floor, a schedule? I love the idea of like taking these scorecards and analyzing them. Garrett, so can you take all your scorecards, upload them, and it can spit out in a report? I mean, gosh, we could probably have a whole show about this, but one of my clients, we were just talking a couple weeks ago, she's doing this really cool offsite event in addition to the trade show. And she's like, well, I have this idea, but I don't know how to do it. Do you have any advice? And I was like, why don't we just ask ChatGPT? And it built out a whole agenda for the entire dinner. And, who's going to be sitting with who based off of, job titles. And you can really, now, is it going to be perfect? No, you're going to have to make some adjustments, but it gets the ball rolling. Right. I love the idea of using AI in your 2026 planning. And I think it allows you to open up your brain to do other things and really like, what is big picture? What are you trying to accomplish? And how is this going to help with your entire company's business objectives? What are
Yeah.
some other tools or frameworks or methods that you think anybody should be adopting or utilizing that's not necessarily AI?
So the game changer for us has been the meeting scheduling. I think, while some might think that you can use a spreadsheet, a tool like that, if that is part of your strategy, is absolutely essential in any toolkit. I think as far as frameworks go, when you're planning, I think, looking at product roadmaps, product launches, aligning with those things to make sure that what you're showing in your event aligns with those. Submitting for speaking sessions and thought leadership types of opportunities also plays really nicely into those types of timelines. So again, I feel like we're on record here, we're just repeating, but the value of cross-functional alignment and making sure that your entire company is headed in the same direction is essential.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think for me, one of the best tools that I think can be used is sort of this idea of a speaker database. So putting information into a database that is searchable, and there are certainly tools and technology tools. I won't be an advertisement necessarily in this particular venture, but I think there's definitely a lot of great tools out there where you can upload all of your speakers, your customer advocates, and put in ratings of how well did the speaker perform, what was the customer sentiment, and then you can search. So let's say, your stakeholders say, we really want to focus on this as a topic. You can go in and search that as a topic, and all of the speakers that can speak to that topic come up. And then you can see how you have that relationship, who can make the connection for you to connect with that particular person, or maybe it's somebody that you put in there. But it allows for a repository of all of those agendas that you build year over year to essentially become this searchable, verifiable resource for you to reference. And I think it's really a game changer when it comes to building out agendas and thinking about content, and something that I've found really valuable.
I love that idea. Yeah, the organization, right? And that allows some personalization, right, with what you're trying to accomplish and have all of the information right at your fingertips for sure. What are some common pitfalls that you really see that teams or organizations hit during planning?
Oh, this is a good one for me, Coty. I've got one of the things that consistently throughout my career I've come up against is, well, this is the way we've always done it. Or we have to do it because we just have always gone to this particular show, or we've always done the event this way. We have to do it this way. And, then there's my counteractive, why? What are we trying to accomplish here? Where's the data that shows that we have to do this year over year? And so I think that's one of the biggest pitfalls is folks just doing things because that's the way it's always historically been done. So, not to say change is a constant, but, it needs to be a constant all the time. But I think don't ever settle for, okay, I think you should always be thinking about evolution because your customers are always evolving and the people that are coming to your events are always evolving and the generational impact of who's coming to our events is evolving. And so if you keep doing things the same way, eventually your event's going to be stale and nobody's going to want to go. So I think that, is really, you're doing yourselves a disservice if you're not keeping up with, again, like the buzzwords and trends and things like that. But if you're not continuously looking at your events and how they perform and figuring out how you can evolve, then, you're eventually going to become stale and you're going to wonder why your events aren't garnering the same interest. And, that it's going to start to bite you if you aren't proactive with your innovation.
That's so true. How about you, Garrett?
I actually wrote the exact same thing, but thank God I have a plan B answer. So mine, I think, would also be we don't have the budget. I think if it is the right thing to do, strategically aligned with the priorities that your company has set, there's a way for you to make it work. And it may not be as big of a presence, it may not be as big of a booth, but finding ulterior ways to still be there and showcase your brand. There's a number of different ways that your presence can still be visible, remembered, engaging with customers, right? Without having maybe the traditional, we have to have a 20 by 20 booth, right? So I think just getting creative and if, again, aligning with your company initiatives, your strategies, your priorities, if it's the right thing to do, there are definitely ways that you can show up without the dollar amount being the end all be all.
I call that getting scrappy.
That's right.
Right. And I think
What can you do?
plays to like the way things, the looking backwards, but it also in looking forwards when people come to you and say, we've got to be at this event. Everybody's here. We've got to look at this event. It's going to be so important that we're there. We're going to, not exist as a company if we're not there. And, all these people that get super passionate. And I think there's ways to address that and say, pilot is a really good word that I love to use. Let's pilot something or let's do the research. So send a couple of people armed with, maybe an app-based lead scanner to capture the types of people that we'd be interacting with at that event and evaluate it for future investment. I think that's always a good way to say, I hear you, I understand that you feel it's valuable, but let's test that before we make a large investment in this type of event. So that's always something that I thought has been really helpful in sort of that forward-looking approach.
Michelle wants to know if you guys are doing exit surveys at all.
We do customer surveys post-event, but not like on-site exit surveys, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, I have in my past done exit surveys in particular for third-party events where before people exit a booth, there's just a one-hit question that we build into the lead retrieval to say, did you get, I forget exactly how we phrased it, but something along the lines of, was your time valuable? Did you get value out of your time spent with us here today? And then, that was just sort of a one hit. I have actually done that sort of smiley face, like, is this bathroom clean, from green to red with the different emotions of, yes, I'm very satisfied to, no, I'm not, and put that on an iPad in the booth and, had people put it strategically in a place where, it made sense for the kind of exit of someone's experience within a trade show booth. So I definitely have done that in the past.
That's good. I love this question. And so I'm hoping both of you can answer this one. But what's one thing that you're doing now that you were wishing you started earlier in your career?
I'd say knowing when to say no. And I think when you're starting off in your career, it's a little more challenging based on, seniority or whatnot. But I'm super protective of my team and their time and kind of scaling feasibility of their workloads. Everybody wants to do an event outside of event professionals. Everyone thinks we just throw parties, right? They're fun to attend, get you out of the office. It seems like the right thing to do, but they are also extremely labor intensive. And so I think the ability to be very strategic, be confident in that strategy and understanding the limits of your team will be, will definitely help them work with you much longer in the long run. So I think that would be mine.
Knowing when to
That's
say no, that's
fantastic. Yeah, that's a
good.
fantastic
It's
answer.
so good.
I think for me, my biggest, like if I could like tell my 25-year ago self one thing, it would be find your tribe. I think as you know, I've always been an active member of the event community. I've always volunteered in some capacity, whether it just be joining a local chapter association and volunteering to be an active member so that I'm meeting people. I think the more that I've done that and the more that I found like specificity on exactly my type, like right now I have a lot of networking specifically with event leaders, which is so helpful for me because a lot of the times, especially when you get into leadership, the people above you don't necessarily have their finger on the pulse of the industry, or they don't necessarily do events per se. They might, they're responsible for it because you're there, but having a bunch of leaders that you can bounce ideas off of or that you can collaborate with has been a game changer for me because it's really helpful from a benchmarking perspective to look at, what are other people doing? Having those direct tap into a group of people that I can ask those questions to has been enormously valuable. So I think, there's obviously a lot of industry associations, pick one that aligns best to what it is that you're trying to do. And maybe not even just do right at the moment, but aspire to do and surround yourself with those people and pick their brains and learn from them. And I think that is going to, be your events are all about who you know, being able to call in a favor. And so I think, finding your tribe and establishing those relationships early on in your career is really important.
I get this feedback a lot, or that I see that a lot of event marketers, like, when we're on the go mode, right? We're in our own bubble. And all the while, all of us are in similar lanes and dealing with similar issues. It doesn't matter the industry, it doesn't even matter, the level you're at, because we all face, very similar challenges, and you don't feel as alone when you have others around you. It's very validating, and you can get so much insight of, I'm facing this challenge. Oh, well, somebody's tried it this way. Never thought of that. That just dawned on me, right? There's been so much insight, when you're surrounding yourself by others and just get out of your own bubble. And that can be hard because your to-do list is long, everything that's coming at you and that you're responsible for, it weighs heavy on your shoulders. But there is an internal driver, like we do these things for a reason, and that's to get communities together to connect. That's what events are for. And so we too have to treat ourselves with the same respect of building a community around ourselves to be motivated and to support each other during the hard times and even the fun times. I mean, I cannot tell you how much I loved Garrett hanging out with you at our own event, and Sarah finally getting to meet you at SEMA. I mean, it's just so, it like breathes a fresh breath of air right into you, it energizes you a bit. So I love that you guys brought both of those things up. Now, we have a question in here. How are you managing the dual in-person and virtual events to get more butts and seats where companies are not allowing the budget to attend in person? And how are you demonstrating the in-person value without diminishing virtual?
I am dealing with this in spades right now within the context of a user conference series. And we have 3 global locations as well as a virtual version of the event to close out. And so kind of our answer to that was, if you can't make it in person, don't worry, because all the sessions will also be available on the virtual event that you can attend for free. I think, there is a loss of, that magical in-person component when they can't make it. But if they can't make it and they still want to, learn or get the content, then they will find a way to show up online or on demand, either live at the virtual event or on demand on their own time. I think for us, it's an understanding of the audience differential. Our in-person component is going to have a lot more thought leadership, a lot more access to experts, a lot of things that they really will value in person. And then our virtual, we know, is that audience is much more technical and they're after a very different set of content. So really understanding your audience and making sure that the content that you're presenting is engaging enough to get them to take time out of their day and watch it on the virtual end.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, you have to define what it is you're trying to accomplish. Again, every good event starts with goals and objectives, right? And so from a virtual standpoint, are you just trying to get content into the hands and are you trying to build awareness, or are you trying to build community? Are you trying to increase interactivity? because there's different virtual event types. There's broadcasts where you're just literally replaying something that was previously recorded, or
Right.
pre-recording things and putting it out there. But then there's sort of this hybrid component where you have a live component, and then you also have a purposeful virtual component. And, as a digital event strategist, this is something that people argue about. What does hybrid mean all the time, right? A digital event strategist is that if you have a hybrid event, you're specifically curating an experience for the people that are virtually online. That includes some sort of interactivity with the content, with the speakers. And there's a deeper level of engagement than just a broadcast, or than just camera in the back of the room giving people FOMO that they're not actually sitting there listening to what the speaker is saying live.
Right.
So I think you really have to define what it is you're trying to accomplish and why you may need to have. I know that budget obviously is a concern, but beyond the budget, it has to be really about what are you trying to achieve. And then I think you can sort of define what the virtual component of your event needs to look like from there.
I love that. Okay, so we're looking ahead at 2026. We just covered so much in just an hour, just under an hour so far. So I want to recap this a little bit. So if you're planning ahead for 2026, here are some of the core things that came out of this conversation. You're going to set dates, right? Have those dates planned in advance. When are you going to have conversations, and at what stage you're going to talk about that? Mark time to analyze the data from previous years, scorecards, individual metrics. And you also want to determine where and how you're planning to show up, or where you want to show up. And then I like, Garrett, what you said is like kind of doing like a scorecard for that too, like measuring it, based on score. Then you add all of that up, and then you help determine your goals, right? Overall business metrics and goals that you want to track, and how those events can really help get you there. Determining the budget at that point, hopefully not set in advance if you can't ever control that. Your execution plan, and then what's happening afterwards. What's your plan for reviewing and reporting? Is there anything else I'm missing there?
Sounds pretty good to me.
Pretty
You did
straightforward,
great.
right?
Yeah.
Any other, I always love wrapping up with one final question. Is there one specific metric that you are like, you're going to forever defend? Is it like a diehard metric that's the must have that, maybe the CFO or your stakeholders like, no, that doesn't matter, but you're always going to forever say, this matters to me?
For me, it's velocity, right? Because
Love
it's
it.
not just about what deals closed at the event or what dollar amount came in. It's also about the movement from one sales stage to the next, which can be attributed back to the event and is very important. So I think if you can determine a measurable way to look at velocity and what the impact of your event was on the movement forward or backward, hopefully not, but if you can have that visibility, I think that's really important, and it is definitely an attributable metric that some people say, oh, well,
I
that
love
doesn't
it.
count. There's 45,000 other things that we're doing. But if you can say within 30 days, if that moved to another stage, we're taking credit.
Velocity is really a key metric, I think, is so important. How about you, Garrett?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, revenue is the obvious, core, we wouldn't be here at all without that. But I also think like the NPS component, and it's so hard to measure. That's the only thing. It's just, but when you know that, someone new is talking to your company because an existing customer referred them, it just adds value to your pipeline. It shows that, it's one thing to say that your product is great, but to have third parties say, hey, this is the answer. We've worked with them. We trust them. They're going to carry you through long term. I think that's another critical metric for success.
I love it. So there you have it. We've got a whole strategy for 2026, everything you need to know from to. I mean, I am so incredibly impressed by both of you. You guys are amazing. You both are doing it. You've done it. Like, this is great advice for everyone that's getting ready for next year. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Garrett. And happy back to school season.